Chapter 45. To compose in Nuit Blanche. Fragrance added by red sleeves. This was a question to which Julien already vaguely knew the answer, but Huacheng's reaction was not what he expected. After a brief silence, Huacheng blurted out, "I'm sorry." Julien was puzzled. What? His first assumption was that if Thousand Lights Temple wasn't some kind of a joke, the individual most directly tied to the incident could only be Huacheng. But no matter how off the mark he might have been with his guess, there was no reason for Huacheng to apologize. Huacheng didn't respond, just gestured Julien to keep walking with him, so Julien followed his lead. They walked for a while, and after making a turn, the sight before him opened to a broad horizon. Before Julien's eyes rose a temple that glowed with quiet transcendence. In an instant, his breath hitched. All around them, the colors of the ghost realm crisscrossed. Smoke grays and vivid scarlets. Surrounded by a backdrop stood that temple, majestic and splendid, its thousands of lights resplendent, as though this were paradise itself. A temple founded on such radiance and brilliance was out of place sitting within the rowdy, chaotic pandemonium of Ghost City, but it inspired awe all the same. The second that one laid eyes upon it, it left a deep, enduring impression. It took a long time before Julien found his voice. "This is..." The pair stood before the temple, gazing at the structure with admiration. Huacheng raised his head slightly and explained, "It was the Mid-Autumn Festival a few days ago, and I figured Gaga would probably join that rabble in their frivolous games. So I set this place up to provide Gaga with some amusement while attending the banquet, to make things interesting and relieve your boredom." Huacheng's approach to relieving boredom was much too sensational. For the sake of Julien's amusement, he had built a temple and raised 3,000 blessings lanterns of everlasting light. Huacheng lowered his head, fixing his cuffs as he continued. "I didn't want you to know, because I arranged all this without permission. Pray Gaga isn't offended that I built Gaga's temple in such an unruly place." Julien immediately shook his head. It seemed Huacheng hadn't wanted to tell Julien of it because he thought he was causing Julien trouble. He really didn't know what to say. At this point, giving thanks again would fall flat. Thus, Julien steadied himself, drew in a deep breath, and proceeded to admire this Thousand Lights temple with renewed care. A brief moment later, he tilted his head and asked, "This temple is a singularly beautiful work of architecture, and massive as well. The artistry and craftsmanship of its edifice is divine. It couldn't have been constructed in mere days. Sanlung, you didn't build this only recently, did you?" Huacheng smiled. "Of course not. Gaga has a good eye. This was built a long time ago. I never found a use for it, so I had it hidden away. No one has ever been allowed inside. I'll have to thank Gaga for finally giving it purpose and allowing it to see the light of day." Julien was surprisingly relieved to hear this. If it had been built a long time ago for some other reason, but never properly settled into a use, then it had only been adopted for convenience's sake. If Huacheng really had constructed a temple just for Julien, he would feel even more uneasy. Of course, with Huacheng's personality, it could very well have been built solely to amuse himself. Although Julien was quite curious as to why Huacheng would construct a building that's so vastly different from the rest of Ghost City, he contained the impulse to ask. It wasn't a good habit to pry, lest one accidentally ask what one shouldn't. "Want to go in and take a look?" Huacheng asked. "Of course," Julien answered cheerfully. Side by side, they entered the temple, leisurely strolling down the jadestone path. The interior of the temple was spacious and bright, but it didn't have a defined statue, nor any cushions for worshippers to kneel upon. "This was built in a hurry, so there are many careless and thoughtless elements," Huacheng explained. "Pray Gaga forgives me." Julien grinned. "Not at all. I think this is very nice. Very, very nice. It's good that there isn't an idol or cushions, and best if there won't ever be. But how come there's no establishment plaque?" He wasn't calling Huacheng on a fault. It was just that even the jade stones paving the temple's paths were meticulously engraved with Thousand Lights Temple, but the establishment plaque above the entrance was missing. Naturally, it couldn't have been a simple oversight, hence Julien's curiosity. Huacheng chuckled. "It can't be helped. There isn't really anyone around here who can write. Just think of that crowd earlier. It'd be impressive if they could even recognize letters. Does Gaga like any particular calligraphy masters? I'll invite them over to help compose the plaque. Although, in my opinion, the best solution would be for Gaga himself to draw up a sign and hang it over the Thousand Lights temple. That would be more than splendid." As he spoke, he pointed to the altar in the great hall. This jade altar table was exceedingly long and wide, and various offerings and an incense burner were neatly placed upon it. There were even brushes, inkstones, and paper, providing an air of scholastic elegance. The pair approached the table, and Julien asked, Why doesn't Sanlang compose one for me? Hua Chung's eye slightly widened at the suggestion, like the thought was unexpected. Me? Yeah, Shilian replied. Hua Chung pointed at himself. You really want me to write? Shilian noticed his discomfort and asked, Will it trouble Sanlang? Hua Chung cocked an eyebrow and replied, No, it's just... Seeing that Shilian was waiting for him to answer, he clasped his hands behind his back and continued, somewhat helplessly. All right, it's just... I don't write well. Now this was something new. Shilian truly couldn't imagine that there was anything Hua Chung couldn't do well. He smiled. Oh, really? Will you write something and show me? Are you sure? Hua Chung asked once more. Shilian took out a few sheets of blank paper, laid them neatly upon the jade altar table, and attentively flattened them. He then picked a fine-looking xiao brush made of brown rabbit fur and placed it in Hua Chung's hand. Come. As Shilian had prepared everything, Hua Chung relented. Fine, but don't laugh. Shilian nodded. Of course. Thus, Hua Chung took the brush and started writing, assuming a serious air. Shilian stood next to him and watched, but the more he watched, the more unreadable his face grew. Shilian genuinely wanted to hold it in, but he failed. As Hua Chung wreaked mad havoc on the paper, he chided Shilian half in warning and half in jest. Gaga. Shilian immediately schooled his expression. My bad. He didn't want to laugh, but what could he do? Hua Chung's writing was just too funny. Of all the crazed brushwork Shilian had ever witnessed, none could even measure halfway to Hua Chung's wild script, a wildness that carried a wicked whirlwind of malevolence. If any calligraphy teachers saw it, their eyes would roll back and they'd perish on the spot. After a long time with immense difficulty, Shilian managed to make out sea, water, peak, clouds, and other such words through the scrawl. He guessed Hua Chung must be writing, After seeing the vast sea, no water can compare. Scattered from the peak of Mount Wu, there are no other clouds. Hua Chung was master of the ghost realm, and feared by all of heaven and hell. To think he was finally showing such a vulnerable side of himself because of something like writing. The thought alone was going to make Shilian's gut burst from holding in his laughter. Hua Chung completed the piece with a wave of his hand, and Shilian forcibly feigned calm as he picked up the end product, using both of his own. Good. It's got such personality and essence all its own. It's got style. Hua Chung put down the brush, looking like he had the posture wholly perfected. He smiled with his eye in a crescent. Madness, you mean? Shilian pretended not to hear, and began to offer commentary with a straight face. In fact, writing well is not difficult. What's difficult is writing with a unique style. If one's calligraphy looks good in the same way that thousands of other works look good, then it's nothing more than common. Sunlung has a good foundation, the flair of a master, the daring spirit that conquers the world. There were two other idioms that followed. Broken land, armies in turmoil. It can't be helped. Fabricating praise is hard work. Hua Chung stood there, and the more he listened, the higher his brows raised. Really? He asked doubtfully. When have I ever lied to Sanlang? Shilian asked. Hua Chung calmly and languidly added a few more incense blocks to the small golden vessel on the side, and in the midst of that fresh, faint fragrance, he continued with an air of nonchalance. I do want to write well, but there's no one to teach me, and I don't know if there are any tricks to the art. He had certainly asked the right person. Shilian hummed and replied, There's really no trick to it, just... Shilian considered it, but in the end he felt he couldn't explain everything he wanted to with words alone. So he shuffled closer to pick up the brush himself and wrote the last two verses of the poem Hua Chung had started. It was done in one breath, and after staring at it for a moment, he sighed a rueful chuckle. How shameful. I haven't had much chance to write in many years, so I'm not as good anymore. Hua Chung stared at the four verses that looked as vastly different as heaven and hell, the style of the characters foreign to each other, especially the last two verses that Shilian had added to finish the poem. Many times I've passed through the flowers, yet I spared them no glance, for half my fate is in cultivation, and the other half in you. He connected the verses together and read them a few times, his eye twinkling and unmoving from the page. It was a while before he looked up. Teach me. Well, I dare not lecture, Shilian said. Thus, he began to give Hua Chung a detailed introduction to calligraphy without holding back, providing insights in all that he'd learned from practice in his younger years. They were surrounded by subtly perfumed air and brilliant lights. Within the great hall, their chatter was low, light, and leisurely. Shilian lectured earnestly, and Hua Chung listened intently. It painted a soft picture. After a while, Shilian prompted him, Why don't you try again? Hua Chung agreed obediently, and took the brush from his hand to write another few characters, his expression serious. Shilian crossed his arms as he watched, tilting his head. Interesting, but he still felt there was something off about the way Hua Cheng put his brush to paper. He observed with a frown, and suddenly realized where exactly it was going wrong. Hua Cheng wasn't holding the brush correctly to begin with. If even the way he held the brush was all over the place, of course it would come out strange. Shilian didn't know whether to laugh or cry and stood closer, reaching out to correct him without thinking. You're holding it wrong. It's like this. Only after he reached out did he suddenly realize that his actions might be inappropriate. He wasn't an elderly teacher tutoring a young disciple, so to instruct Huasheng by guiding his hand might be overly familiar. However, since the hand was already out, there was no reason to pull back rashly. He'd only appear overly self-conscious. So after some hesitation, Shilian didn't remove his hand. He remembered the gambler's den. Hadn't Huacheng taught him how to roll dice like this, hand on hand? Although Shilian felt that he had learned absolutely nothing then, and even had a sneaking suspicion he'd somehow been deceived. Here and now, he was sincere in his desire to teach Huacheng. Thus, Shilian's warm palm relaxed as it pressed close against Huacheng's cold hand. With a gentle hold, he led Huacheng's hand to guide the brush across the paper, whispering, like this. He sensed Huacheng's brush going wilder under his hand, so he pressed down a little more firmly to control and correct its path. It didn't take long before it veered further off course, resisting the control, so Shilian had to grasp tighter. The characters drawn through their power combined were crooked and twisted, unseemly and ugly, and the more Shilian guided, the more he felt something was off. Finally, he couldn't help but gape at the results. What? The ink on the paper had run tyrannically askew, as if this were a successfully silly prank. Huacheng snickered softly, leaving Shilian exasperated. Sunlung, don't be like this. Learn properly. Write properly. Okay, Huacheng obediently acquiesced. It was blatantly obvious that he was only pretending to be serious. Shilian shook his head, feeling ridiculous. Huacheng's hand might have been cold, but for some reason it felt like a lump of hot coal in his grasp. Shilian didn't dare hold him any tighter. His eyes wandered to the edge of the altar, and he stopped. At the corner of the jade altar sat a tiny, lonesome flower. That is chapter 45.